Yeah.
Доброго дня.
Good afternoon. We are starting our discussion. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to those who are watching us online. We invited our key people who could be able to explain what's happening around the business project Nord Stream 2, which is Russian Federation preparing. And we are here to listen to MPs who are working actively on the international arena, on Olena Zerkal, Deputy Foreign Minister of Ukraine, from the representatives of Naftogaz and experts. What is the position of Ukraine as to Nord Stream 2, as to energy diplomacy in general? Because that's one of very painful issues. We're happy to welcome Mr. Alan Riley, who will make the presentation of the situation, the assessment of the Nord Stream 2 from the point of view of international expert community. And there will be also Mykhailo Krutikhin from Russia, the expert. He will be speaking via Skype. So we need to, we will be discussing what is Ukraine doing, what it will be doing. First, I will invite MPs to take the floor. Hanna Hopko, and then Kater Buchkovska. Then we'll hear the presentation of Mr. Riley, and then we will listen to experts on what could be done next year so that the situation is less threatful. I will request you to take up to 7 minutes so that we have enough time for discussion. Thank you to organizers. It is very important. In the beginning of autumn, together with the Committee on Energy Security, we have organized the roundtable on energy diplomacy, where we invited very important experts, and at a parliamentary platform we were discussing what are the strategic directions that Ukraine is to develop. On the 7th of December in Parliament, there will be parliamentary hearings. We'll be discussing the issues of foreign policy of Ukraine, and during these hearings, one of the issues will be defense of national interests and energy security of not just Ukraine but of Europe. This is a short update. Also, I would like to say that the Parliament reacted recently when there was the address from the Parliament to executive authorities, to parliaments of the countries of European Union, as to strengthening cooperation with Ukraine in energy sphere and not preventing the construction of all gas pipelines around which will circumvent Ukraine. And the attention was paid to the fact that Ukraine is a reliable partner. There are several laws that were passed, the gas market law, energy regulator law. Natalia Kacer-Buchkovska will talk about that more, and also it is important to talk about corruption in the energy sector. The influence of oligarchs is still present. We cannot say that everything's ideal, but the steps counteracting such oligarchs as Firtash, when the law on gas market was discussed, then the laws on solar, on alternative energy sources. So we are making steps, but there are such things as Rotterdam Plus, which are quite negatively impacting Ukraine. But we are confirming that we are reliable partners for European Union. When there was a summit, Ukraine, the EU energy memorandum was signed. We would like to see practical steps. After that, one of the articles, together with Mykhailo, we were writing that the European Union is strengthening Russian aggression against Ukraine and Syria, because they are consuming 3/4 part of oil and gas, and the European Union should also think about how to diversify their consumption, so that Russia is not the monopolist in supplying oil and gas, because Russia this way gets money into the budget, and part of that money go to different military operations, creating the zones of instability. And that's the issue of responsibility of European Union and reorientation of energy strategy. And we are calling you to support us in that work. To clarify, Gan, I would like to ask you, you talk a lot with foreign partners, you know what their position is, and you mentioned the necessity to reform this sector. From your point of view, what processes should be completed next year so that we have the possibility to represent ourselves as real partners? What decisions are important for that? The general message is to speed up the rates of reforming all the sectors, and the very important part is implementing amendments to Constitution. It is also important to have full-fledged anti-corruption institutions. It is important that National Anti-Corruption Bureau doesn't depend on the security service. We need to have a very good, sound competition between the law enforcement bodies. We need to renew the Chamber of Accounts, and there is it is very important to renew the members of the Central Election Committee. Natalia is talking to the representatives of the State Department of the European Energy Community, but I would like to say that we need to speed up the reforms, because in some directions there is a big sabotage. And if we look at the law on the single regulator, the law was signed 12 days later than it had to be signed. There are things which make us wonder, and the law on regulator had to be approved a year ago, but the internal fighting between the parties and between the authorities who will be controlling does not help us, and it is important for us to mobilize all the resources to understand that very often to have positive image, though very often the situation inside the country looks better than outside, but it is very important to show some successes, and we will see how the budget for the next year will work. We will need to continue financial decentralization. We need to continue helping local communities to develop their activities. So we need to understand that now, taking into account the Russian aggression in the east of Ukraine, the elections that will be taking place in Germany and France, and the referendum in Italy, in order to keep Ukraine in the center of attention, we need to put a lot of efforts. And I would like to thank you for this brochure, Nord Stream 2. And we do understand that Nord Stream 2 is designed to eliminate Ukrainian economy transportation system, and this way Europe will have a big threat. We need to get united. We need to remind Europe that the values should be of paramount importance, but not the economic interests which give a short-term benefits, but which for long-term have many threats. Natalia Kacer-Buczkowska, you wrote a lot on energy security. What does it mean to get united, and what does it mean to remind Europe? What messages can we use?
Good afternoon, dear audience. Thank you to the organizers for this event, for organizing it, and to Mr. Riley for arriving and for his report he is going to present us today. Nord Stream is very important thing for Ukraine, because Ukraine should focus and attract attention of other countries to this issue. I will start with it. Since 2013-2014, Ukraine has been dependent, as well as in previous years, on gas supplies from Russia. Today, after the aggression on the south of Ukraine and the east of Ukraine, we need to diversify gas supplies to Ukraine, and there is an issue to counteract the aggression and the war, and the energy sector is an important tool to do so. We should mention that during these several years, Ukraine have diversified the supplies of resources. For 1 year, we have not had direct supplies from Gazprom of Russia, thanks to Naftogaz of Ukraine efforts. Ukraine diversified supplies, buying the gas from European countries at lower prices. This is our direct achievement. But Russia seeks ways how to respond to the successes of Ukraine and in diversification areas. So now they put efforts to push Ukraine from this transportation routes, and this project is political. The project of bypass in Ukraine, due to which Ukraine can lose $2 billion. This would threaten our security and our successes on European markets. The decisions on district heating, where European Commission allowed to use more capacities of this stream by 50%. This, and also negotiations with Turkey. Our country is in the situation when after 2019, after the contract for transportation of natural gas expires, our country may lose our gas transportation capacities. So facing this challenge, which is very serious, Ukrainian diplomats should unite and rebuff and remind the EU about the European values and European laws and the standing of Ukraine on the energy market. And in this aspect, many efforts are being put now. Ghana told that we held the round table on discussion at the level of Parliament, and our parliamentarians they addressed the EU parliamentarians seeking support to Ukrainian energy sector reforms, to provide information on the successes of Ukrainian reforms, and they called on the EU parliamentarians to defend and protect Ukraine, because it's a perspective. They also have a threat for EU. We compiled a letter to the Cabinet of Ministers on energy security. And we lobby this issue now so that Ukraine has representation at the Energy Security Committee of NATO. There were many publications as well and events where our delegation took part at the international level thanks to our Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So we have been putting efforts, but so far we should mobilize more and put more efforts, and these efforts should be centralized. NGOs and experts and me, we support the idea to draft the law on energy security, where we should talk about the threats and we should set forth mechanisms to counteract and mitigate the threats. And how Ukraine, in what format Ukraine can coordinate energy sector security and diplomacy efforts. We should focus our efforts, concentrate them. The threat is very real and actual, and we should minimize it via next steps in strengthening energy diplomacy and energy security. We have much to do.
Ставлю дуже коротке уточнення.
What do you think the key risks for the next year? What could be done or not done in Ukraine out of reforms which will make us weaker at the international arena? First of all, as it has been mentioned correctly, talking about transportation and the natural gas market, Ukraine passed the law on the natural gas market. Ukraine passed the law on regulator, independent energy regulator, and these are the reforms which were required by the European Union. And the major argument of why all these streams are being built and why these initiatives are being implemented are that Ukraine is not reliable transit supply of gas. But basically, Ukraine is reliable. This is a successful reform, and unbundling of Naftogaz means creating the consortium on gas transportation and involving European investors, companies that will be able to invest into gas transportation system of Ukraine. This will be a certain guarantee of the interests of European countries, because many European countries, Germany, the Netherlands, who are interested in building the Nord Stream, they say that's just business, construction of such streams, but this is not exactly so. Ukraine should demonstrate that it's not just business, it's geopolitics, it's the issue of security, and we need to conduct a lot of information work, and we need to reform gas transportation system of Ukraine. Another important issue is synchronizing Ukrainian energy system with the European, passing the law on the electricity market, which is not directly affecting the transportation of gas, but it shows that the Ukrainian legislation is being harmonized with the European. Thank you. From your permission, I will give the floor to Professor Alan Riley, who prepared a special presentation, analytical presentation on the problems. Yes. The report is on at the reception.
Can I show you slides?
Yeah.
Okay.
Just a moment.
Yeah.
I will forward you. I don't have the short version which you have sent me.
Okay.
Should I send him now, or you will do with your bigger presentation?
I'll use the bigger presentation. I can just follow from that. Okay, well, it's very nice to be here, ladies and gentlemen, in snowy Kiev. What I'm going to try and do is, I think I'm supposed to speak for 20 minutes, is that right?
Yep.
20 minutes. I'm going to try and take you through a paper I wrote for the Centre for European Policy Studies in Brussels, which is about 15,000 words long, and I'm told I have 20 minutes, which is something of a challenge, but we'll see how we can go. And I've got a cut-down version of the paper and the proposal. Now, I understand there's now a Ukrainian version of the paper, which has now been published by the DiXiGroup. So that is now available in the public domain. Whilst they're just sorting out the slides, I'm going to, I'll start and get moving on this. Now, when we're talking about Nord Stream 2, we should understand what we're talking about. This is the latest in a series of diversionary pipelines that Moscow has come up with, right back to the first diversionary pipeline, which was the Yamal pipeline in 1997. And the reality is that ever since the end of the Cold War, the Gazprom and the Russian state recognized that they were over a barrel. At the fall in 1991, Moscow realized to its horror that essentially Ukraine had it over a barrel. The only transport route out of the Russian Federation for the gas, which would go, the natural gas, which would go to Western Europe and to the EU as a whole, where 2/3 of Gazprom's revenue and what amounted to 10% of federal tax revenue went to. So the only way was via Ukraine. So right very early on, the discussions were opened with Poland in around 1993 in relation to the Yamal pipeline, and that came on stream in 97. That goes through Belarus and then through Poland. And then you had discussions fairly early on in the late 90s for the Nord Stream 1 pipeline, and that was construction was begun in about 2007, and that was completed, both pipelines were completed by mid-2012, 2011 and 2012. And then you had discussions about the South Stream pipeline, which went on very extensively and ultimately were cancelled. And then you had discussions about Turkish Stream, which was then cancelled again because of the shooting down of the Russian fighter by the Turks, and then reopened after the coup last July in Turkey. Now, so you've had a series of different pipelines over time, and the latest one is Nord Stream 2. So we should see this, first of all, the context is something that this has been going on for a very long time. It's a continual Russian strategy to deal with the threat that they see of being entirely dependent on Ukraine. I think that is the Russian, all of the other stuff which is used, the obfuscation, the talking about Ukrainian unreliability, it is a sense that it gives Ukraine leverage, and this is something that should be removed. So that, I think, is the starting point of all of this. Now, the difficulty with a lot of this, and this is where I think my legal analysis comes in, is to say, okay, obviously there are a series of legal issues here, but the first question we might want to ask is, why is it so bad? And I think the answer to why it is so bad is to look at it from two perspectives. First of all, from the Ukrainian perspective, and then from the EU perspective. Now, obviously, one of the reasons why it's not good for Ukraine is that you're going to lose between $1 to $2 billion dollars in transit revenues, which is a not insignificant amount of money. And given the fact that the US and the EU are trying to help support Ukraine and provide funds and so forth, it is a bit odd to see the EU and particularly Germany supporting a project which will actually result in Ukraine losing revenues. The other issue is the loss of throughput security. That if you have gas transiting through Ukraine, the idea that you could cut off Ukraine and ultimately threaten supplies to Western Europe creates a degree of, how can I put it, unwillingness of Russia to cut off gas to Ukraine if you're going to use gas from Russia. The other element of this is the reverse flow element. Now, you know, as we were discussing earlier, the reverse flow developments by Naftogaz over the last 3 years have been fantastic. They have transformed the situation for Ukraine. They have brought in a lot of gas from Central and Eastern Europe. That gas obviously was originally Russian gas, and the idea is like, at least in theory, the gas comes through Ukraine on transit into Poland or Hungary or Germany. The legal title passes to the Hungarians and Poles and Germans, and they then reverse flow that gas, because it's now their gas, to Ukraine at prices which are lower than the prices that Gazprom will be willing to charge Naftogaz. So you save money and you get the supply security from obtaining gas from European countries. So this reverse flow thing is great. It provides Ukraine with alternatives. The trouble is with Nord Stream 2 is once you set up a system where Nord Stream, and this is really quite an important point about it, you've got all of the gas going via Nord Stream 2, pretty much all the gas going into Europe going via Nord Stream 2 and Yamal, and particularly Nord Stream 2 and Nord Stream 1. The real danger that you have got is that that gas then goes through a connecting pipelines, Opal, okay, thank you, Opal and Oigal, which are substantially controlled by Gazprom, unlike the Ukrainian transit and then the connecting pipelines through the European Union. And because the pipelines, Opal and Ugal, the connecting pipelines to Nord Stream, are controlled by Gazprom, the likelihood is it is going to be much more difficult to ensure that reverse flows happen, because the Gazprom will have a much better idea of how much gas Poland, Hungary or Germany is using and only provide that gas. And of course, this is not a theoretical threat, because in 2014 and 2015, that's exactly what Gazprom tried to do to Ukraine. And the danger is Nord Stream 2 will make it easier. So one of the problems with this is that it potentially makes reverse flow more difficult. Another problem is that it makes Ukraine less important to the EU. One of the reasons, let's be kind of the brutal geopolitics of this, is Ukraine is important to the EU in part because a lot of European gas flows across Ukraine, and if there's any cut-off, there's any issue, prime ministers get woken up in their beds at night if the gas flows stop. So that's an issue which means that Ukraine is important. It makes Ukraine less important to the EU, and it makes it more easier for the Russians to say, well, this is Ukraine, but how important is it to us? How important is it to you? Let us get on with dealing with Ukraine. So there's a real danger of Ukraine being isolated and more vulnerable as a result of this, and I'm sure that's part of the Russian strategy. Now I'm just going to try and make this work. I'll see if I can. Okay, I'm going to go, these are some of the, right, why was that? So that's Nord Stream 2, why is it so bad? Nord Stream 2, why is it so bad too, if you like? And there's the European arguments. And the European arguments for why it's so bad for Europe, one is the same as Ukraine, throughput security. Now, the interesting thing with the Europeans is that there's a lot of evidence of it. Robert Larsson, in a major paper, a book really, for the Swedish Defence Research Agency, identified 40 politically motivated cut-offs between 1991 and 2004, at least 40. The reverse flow issues apply not merely to Ukraine, they also apply to Central and Eastern Europe. because one of the arguments that the German Vice-Chancellor, Sigmar Gabriel, used when trying to justify Nord Stream 2 to a lot of Central and Eastern European governments, he says, well, there's no problem. The gas will come via Nord Stream 2, and then we can send it on to you through the connecting pipelines. And the argument the Central and Eastern Europeans raised was, hold on a second here, we know about this because we've seen what happened to the Ukrainians when Gazprom tried to stop reverse flows. They could do the same to us. As long as gas is flowing onward from Western Europe through our pipelines, we have got some throughput security. What you're doing is taking that throughput security away, and you may have lots of goodwill, and you may do all the right things, but how can we rely on Gazprom not merely reducing the amount of gas so there's only gas for Germany? How do you stop that? And Gabriel couldn't answer that. And also the other point is that by giving Nord Stream 2 this extra gas capacity in northwestern Europe, you're increasing Gazprom's market dominance in the region. Should the European Union be taking a position to do that, to give a company more market dominance? I mean, it already provides about 40% of Germany's gas. You're now going to put it in a position where it can provide more. This is a company which the Commission is investigating for abuses of dominance at the moment. You're also, you've got to ask questions about whether this is anti-competitive of itself. You know, it is undermining incentives to build alternative routes and infrastructure. For example, if you look at the where the connecting pipelines for Nord Stream 2 will go, they actually come out of Greifswald on the East German coast and go straight down past Berlin to the Czech border. Now, Poland and Hungary and Croatia have a plan for the north-south pipeline, which would run from the Polish LNG terminal outside Gdansk all the way down to Kirk, the island of Kirk, where there'd be another LNG terminal, and we'd have this north-south line which will provide alternative route and alternative sources of gas. Now, how likely is that going to be built? Does that not undermine the incentives to build this alternative pipeline if Nord Stream 2 is built? And remember, what you've got with this is not just the Eugal pipeline on that route, which will provide about 50 billion cubic meters of gas capacity. There's already the Opal pipeline, which runs on the same route, which has 36 billion cubic meters. So you're bringing 86 billion cubic meters of capacity controlled by Gazprom straight into the heart of Central Europe. So you've got to ask, does this actually undermine, is this actually anti-competitive? Does it undermine the single market and the whole concept of the energy union? So now let's just turn to the legal analysis, and I'm going to do this quite quickly. My paper goes on extensively about all the legal issues, but just to run through some of them. I think the overarching position that Gazprom has taken has been that, well, there was no problem with Nord Stream 1, so why should there be a problem with Nord Stream 2? And I think part of the trouble is, and there are legal issues about Nord Stream 1 which I'll happily take in questions, but one of the great difficulties with all of this is that I think there's a lack of recognition, both by Gazprom and its Western corporate partners, and by the Kremlin, that since Nord Stream 1 was constructed, the third energy package has not just come into force, but we've had a whole series of decisions, case law, decisional practice rulings, which change the situation. In addition to which, Ukraine is now a member of the energy community, and as I will explain, that changes also the legal analysis here. So, I mean, the essential point, and I think you've got to credit the Russian PR operation, the Gazprom PR operation. It's been very good, because what they've said is, well, the pipeline is in the sea. So that's different. And I have got an entire Brexit joke, which I perhaps should give you, is that I have said, well, if you raise the argument that if you're in the sea, EU law doesn't apply, my country is in the sea, it is an island. So therefore, EU law does not apply to us, and we can remain a member state. And this will be one solution. But the reality is that this is a legally nonsense argument. In all legal systems, whether it's the law of England or the law of Ukraine or the law of Germany, the position is that the law of the land applies to the soil of the nation and its inland waters and its territorial waters usually to 12 nautical miles. And Nord Stream 2 goes through the inland waters of Germany for 50 kilometers and the territorial seas of Germany and Denmark for about 80 to 100 kilometers. So it does go through the territory in which domestic law and EU law applies. Now, there's an argument about the exclusive economic zones of Germany, Denmark, Sweden, and Finland, and actually there's a strong amount of EU case law led by the case called the Habitats Directive, where the Habitats Directive was applied to the exclusive economic zone of the United Kingdom. So the argument is that ECJ is likely to take the view that the exclusive economic zone will be subject to the full application of union law. And the other point is that when the Gazprom raises the arguments about the United Nations Law of the Sea Convention, they say, there are rules under UNCLOS and so on. And that's true, there are rules under UNCLOS about the right to lay pipelines in the exclusive economic zone, subject to various environmental permitting rules. But the point about it is that you can lay the pipelines. There's nothing, we won't stop you laying the pipelines. But what we're saying is that yes, the full application of UNCLOS can take place. But in addition, you have to apply our rules in relation to the management and ownership of the pipelines. So nothing we're saying stops the application of the UNCLOS rules. We're merely applying our rules as well. And as there's no harm to the simple objective of laying a pipeline, there is no conflict. And what the Russians are trying to argue, which I think is legally unsupportable, is that because UNCLOS exists, it's an exclusive regime and no other rules can apply, which seems to me to not be what the contracting parties intended under the UNCLOS regime. So first of all, the EU law does apply, at least the territorial sea and the inland sea. So what does all this mean? Well, essentially, if EU law applies, in principle, you've got two sets of legal regimes which apply. One is to upstream pipelines, and the other is to transmission pipelines. Now, the question, if it's an upstream pipeline, less EU law applies. So one of the arguments that has been raised is that it's an upstream pipeline. However, if you have to stand back and look at this, it's no way can Nord Stream 2 be deemed an upstream pipeline. It's not possible. And the reason for that is that it's an upstream pipeline in the definition in the gas directive is a pipeline which is where you've got a gas or oil production facility which has a pipeline linked to a specific coastal landing point or terminal. Now the problem is that between the Siberian fields that Nord Stream 2 will rely upon and the Nord Stream pipeline is the entire Russian gas network with large numbers of exit and entry points. And it then links at the other end of Nord Stream in Greifswald with the German network. So it cannot be deemed to be an upstream pipeline because the connecting point has an entire network with lots of entry and exit points. It simply is not an upstream pipeline. It's a transmission pipeline linking two networks. And as I've said about this, if it looks like a transmission pipeline, if it walks like a transmission pipeline, if it talks like a transmission pipeline, it is a transmission pipeline. So what does that mean? What it means is that the full application of EU law applies. The ownership and bundling rules is new infrastructure, so therefore they've got to separate the ownership of the pipeline from those who supply it. As Gazprom supplies gas, it cannot own the pipeline. The third-party access rules have got to apply, but of course Gazprom has an export monopoly. So really, in EU law terms, Rosneft and Novatek have to provide the gas, and not Gazprom, or Shell, or somebody else. There's got to be transparent tariff regulation, and the rules have got to be agreed on tariff pricing with the energy regulators in the EU. None of that is something that Gazprom wants, and I think that's the core of the objection to the application of EU law. Is an exemption possible? When you just think about all the things I've been talking about, an exemption, there are a series of conditions in Article 36 of the Gas Directive to promote supply security, to promote competition, the functioning of the single market. Does Nord Stream 2 do any of those things? No, it doesn't add to supply, it diverts it. It doesn't enhance supply security, it actually undermines supply security of the CEE states and Ukraine, and it undermines the operation of the single market. How can you get an Article 36 exemption? Somewhat tricky, I would have thought. Equally, Article 11 of the Gas Directive, a similar issue there in terms of getting a certification that you have supply, that it doesn't risk the supply security of a member state of the European Union. I say we actually have evidence. This is part of the difficulty with this. If it ever ends up before a court, an EU court, it would be very difficult, I think, for Gazprom to proceed and to succeed, because there is evidence. You can't just say, well, this is a theoretical prospect. We have the 1991 to 2004 cut-offs. We have the 06 and 09 cut-offs. We have the threats in relation to reverse flow, an actual reduction of gas supplies in 2014 and 2015. We have a recent threat made to Poland over the application of the third energy package to the YAML pipeline. So, this is not an unserious threat. It actually happens. We have evidence, and evidence can be adduced before a court. So the question then is, how can you get an Article 11 certification from any regulator? That, I think, is tricky. So what other ways of dealing with it could you do? Could you have an intergovernmental agreement? Again, tricky. One of the difficulties is there's a precedent with the YAML pipeline. The European Commission insisted the intergovernmental agreement with Russia was amended to be fully compliant with EU law. Rather difficult to then do a deal via an intergovernmental agreement which didn't comply with EU law. In any event, you can't contract out Article 11. That's a public policy operation by a governmental authority. So you do have this problem. You've got, what about EU law being applied uniformly? The South Stream pipeline was fully subject to EU law. The Commission actually brought infringement proceedings against Bulgaria. YAML pipeline, that was subject to EU law. Okay, it was onshore, but it was built well before the third energy package, but then subject to EU law. But apparently, no application of EU law to Nord Stream 2. That's what the Commission, that's what the Gazprom and Nord Stream 2 are saying. One argument raised by some of the supporters of Nord Stream is that, what about all the pipelines to Algeria and Libya? They are not subject to EU law. Well, most of those pipelines were built well before the third energy package was envisaged. And the truth of the matter is this, is that even if you subject them to, say, Article 11 certification, the Algerians and Libyans have never threatened the supply security of the Union, and you would be able to justify an Article 11 certificate. Whereas the Russians, you are in a much more difficult position because we have evidence, you have cut people off, and we have evidence of it. So, you are in a fundamentally different position to that of the Algerian and Libyan supplies to the Union. Now, I realise I'm conscious I'm using up a lot of time, so just let me briefly run through the connecting pipelines issue. I'm going to leave that one, but let me just talk about EUGAL, which is the connecting pipeline for Nord Stream 2. And it's important, this, because one of the difficulties with Nord Stream, and I think this is one of the other dangers of this whole process, one of the obfuscations that Gazprom has used is they've talked about Nord Stream 2 being in the sea and therefore EU law doesn't apply. One of the other issues is that to some degree they have allowed all the debate to focus on Nord Stream 1, Nord Stream 2 and the pipeline and the issues there. What is overlooked is the connecting pipeline. The connecting pipeline in many ways is more dangerous because it brings almost all of the capacity of Nord Stream 2 onshore and into the EU, into Central Europe. As I said, the total capacity is around 86 billion cubic meters of gas. And the question you've got to ask is, because EUGAL is 50% owned by Gazprom, there are first of all, it gives Gazprom an enormous amount of control. It gives it more control of the direction to which gas supplies will go than it currently has in Europe. And I think that is something which is not understood. I think the other issue is there are serious legal questions about how on earth that can be justified under Article 36 and Article 11. And part of it is, and I've heard some of the Gazprom people in Vienna a couple of weeks ago saying, well, once a TSO, transmission system operator, has received certification, you can never look at it again. And therefore, none of these issues can be looked at because transmission system operators in Germany have already been certified. Now, it's really interesting. In the draft decision on Opal, which I have seen a version of, the Commission is saying, well, we can review the Opal decision because things change over time. Well, I would argue that argument can also be used for EGAL. And we can look at exemption and we can look at Article 11 certification. So I think that's part of it. Now, where are we going to end up with all of this? And I'll stop here, really. What do I think is going to happen? Already, as you're probably aware, in August, the Polish Competition Authority blocked the Nord Stream 2 consortium, so that it stopped the Western parties participating with Gazprom in developing Nord Stream 2. I think there is, as you're probably aware, there have been press releases, so the Polish state energy company PGNiG are going to run a case against Opal and possibly the Gazprom antitrust settlement. There are also a number of other challenges to Nord Stream 2. One of them is an antitrust challenge. A second antitrust challenge is if you've got a situation where you've got a dominant company which is seeking to add capacity at a scale which will make it impossible for any other party to actually operate in the market and will actually own that capacity and control that capacity, can that constitute an abuse of dominance? And there's a case involving Eni in Italy which is, I think, analogous, where you could argue that. There's other issues about Nord Stream 1. Why? I mean, okay, it's true that Nord Stream, the third energy package wasn't available at the time, but the second energy package was, and that even that wasn't applied. Why was that? There are also the potential, say, legal challenges under the EU energy liberalisation rules to Nord Stream 2 directly. And the other bigger question I've got in all of this is, unlike Nord Stream 1, Nord Stream 2 is going to be financed substantially by about 70% from the capital markets. So when you have antitrust challenges in relation to energy liberalisation, how easy is it going to be to persuade some bankers to put up 70% of about 8 billion euro to fund the entire project? And I think that may well be the Achilles heel of Nord Stream 2. At that point, I'll stop. Thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Riley, for your presentation and military terms saying reconnaissance information, so on the issue how we can treat it from the legal point of view. Now we will give the floor to the governmental representative, but I would like also to give the floor to Mr. Krutikhin by Skype first. Good afternoon, Mr. Krutikhin. Have you heard the presentation by Mr. Riley? I know Mr. Riley for many years. Some time ago we had a joint news conference in Riga, and his presentation today was very persuasive, as well as his arguments which he presented. They are very good to counteract Gazprom propaganda and Russian authorities' propaganda. The situation in Russia around this project is as follows. Here, political leadership of Russia still hope to use this project in order to get transportation of natural gas and for Ukraine to lose this opportunity. Russia thinks that they can transport natural gas on the bottom of the sea, Baltic Sea, to Bulgaria, and then further to the south along the infrastructure which does not exist yet, to provide it, to supply it to Greece and even Turkey. bypassing Ukrainian territory. Here we have political component of this project, and commercially this project is unsustainable completely because Russian gas is sold at the German border lower than its costs, including taxes. The main idea on selling this gas to Europe is to counteract future LPG entering the market. Thierry Bro, leading analytics, he said that Russia will lose $1,300,000,000 because of selling Russian gas at the price is lower than its self-cost. So our the friends of President Putin, who are contractors of Gazprom, the Gazprom already announced the tender for building at Russian territory of extension pipelines from Yamal to Baltic Sea. The contracts are concluded, the budgets are spent. Gazprom is now in very bad situation according to recent estimations. The only market where he can expand exports, this is European market, where alternative and renewable energy share is growing. So pipeline natural gas can be also replaced with LPG and LNG. So by 2040, the European demand might increase only by 50 billion cubic meters, not more. So Gazprom seeks the ways how to impact on European consumers. I would like to mention that even if Nord Stream 2 will be in operational condition at 2019, transit via Ukrainian territory will not stop. This transit Gazprom needs to bring gas to Italy, Greece, and so on. So Ukrainian pipelines will not be replaced. It would be impossible for a long time after 2019. That is why Putin instructed Gazprom to renew negotiations with Naftogaz of Ukraine to sign new transit agreement after expiration of the older one. So now I don't see the negotiations ongoing, and we need to hurry up. Yet another aspect, I was at the gas forum in Kiev recently, and there I heard that some foreign investors, they said they complained about Ukrainian authorities' behavior, that they tried to dramatically increase the prices for gas transit via Ukrainian territory. Foreign investors said, "What are you doing? Why are you pushing us closer to Gazprom and Nord Stream 2? I think that Ukrainian authorities and Naftogaz can behave more flexibly. And don't increase prices for gas transit." Thank you very much. We will ask now Naftogaz representatives and authorities representatives who are present here. We will ask them this question. Yet another question, we are interested to hear the answer for. You told that Nord Stream 2 is unprofitable and Gazprom just is forced to invest in it. For how long Russia will be able to carry out such a political project which is not profitable? We can see that Gazprom faces competition with LNG. Gazprom starts to compete with his own pipelines because it has different lines, long-term contracts and spot market where prices are lower. This made Gazprom to compete with itself. And he would like to remain monopolist. When Gazprom sells its gas, the average price at the German border was $4 per million of British units. If we take customs duties and transportation cost, this is low, the price is lower than the self-cost. So if we compare with its major competitor, the gas from other sources, first of all, USA's LPG, we can say that here the competition is rather extensive. The lower the cost, the competitiveness of US gas is higher. Russian ruble, if it is strong, then Russian gas will lose in the competition with US LNG. So if Russian ruble costs less, then it may win. So here will be the competition. And the competitive advantage in Russia. Gazprom within several weeks can sell more than 200 billion cubic meters a year. There are deposits which are not in demand, but they are already in operation, and also the branching networks of Naftogaz is an advantage and support of Russian leadership. They would provide subsidies, preferences to Gazprom, so Gazprom will not lose in this war very soon and easy. Thank you for your participation. I'm giving the floor to Ms. Olena Zerkal. We are very thankful to you for coming here because not many governmental authorities representatives are ready to answer these questions and to comment on these complaints. We would like to hear your position and what you need as a diplomat to be more effective in this work, to be more efficient. Thank you for your invitation. Yes, we have not many experts who can comment on this issue. I took part in all negotiations between Naftogaz and Gazprom, and negotiation which took place in Brussels as concerns Nord Stream 2. Here the issue is rather complicated and integrated, and it concerns our domestic reforms. We provided the reasons for blackmail, the grounds for blackmail, and it concerns Naftogaz reforms, unbundling and creating independent operator. I would like to say that our calls on our foreign partners, they do not find support.
Зацікавлені в будівництві цього потоку. Водночас я хочу сказати, що це не так, оскільки звичайно
Because the pragmatic interests prevail over political. If you look at what happened in Germany and in European Union during the last months, you will understand that on the one hand, they make decisions on extension of sanctions. On the other hand, German regulator makes a decision as to excluding from the control regime of Opal, and they allow to increase. They allow Gazprom to increase their supplies of gas to European market. The same is happening with Nord Stream. In the beginning of the year, we saw a very clear position of 9 countries of Eastern Europe as to building Nord Stream. Now this position is vague and there's no unity among them. That is related, first of all, to the fact that our northern neighbors are very successfully using very simple instruments in their practice, blackmail and bribery. And the operators of the market, European market operators, they are businessmen in their nature, and they are forming a significant amount of budgets in their countries. Besides, we shouldn't be thinking that we do not correspond to their interest to have access to Ukrainian market. We do not give them the opportunities that Russians give them, the opportunities to earn money. And until we are attractive from the point of view of business, all our diplomacy will depend on conducting reforms and on what internal environment will be able to create. In this connection, I would like to say that some steps which are being made, they're quite harmful. When we make a decision not to touch the charter of Naftogaz, that creates turbulence for our foreign partners. And at each meeting that takes place, we always hear one and the same thing. When will the process of unbundling be over, and when will you be able to function as a normal country with the foreseeable environment? And we will not be able to resist the construction of Nord Stream or Turkish Stream because our arguments are very limited, and all diplomacy depend on what are the reforms and what's happening inside the country. Thank you, Olena. Now, Alyona Osmolovska, from your point of view, which things could be called the key things for Ukraine to be perceived as a predictable partner? Thank you for inviting me to this meeting. I would like to say that fighting for the Nord Stream 2 and the others for Ukraine is important, and it has 2 components. About 30% of what we can do in the abroad, and that is through talking about our discussions with the companies, consumers in Europe, our relations with the US, but I would like to draw your attention that 70% of what we can do to counteract these projects is what we do in Ukraine. There are some steps which Ukraine made to protect themselves in this fight. We have approved a very good law on natural gas market. We have the approved draft on unbundling of Naftogaz, and what we can do, that is what we can do to help fighting against these threats. That is to execute what has been approved. And as to Naftogaz, these three things, these three documents which are approved by the country, these will help us a lot in this fight. Thank you. Olena Pavlenko, the head of DiXiGroup, organizer of our today's event. Which key things should we be paying attention to? What needs to be done to follow all these key points? Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank all the speakers because despite the fact that a lot is happening with the energy sector, but that is one of very specific and one of very expert-like discussions. Thank you for a very high quality of presentations. Answering your question, I would subdivide it into two. First, these are long-term things that we need to implement, and I agree with the Deputy Minister and with Alyona Osmolovska that everything's in our hands. Also, we've heard same messages from European companies when we were traveling to participate in different conferences, and in this part the work of ENG is very successful, and this will become an example for European companies. If their work is successful, they will come to Ukrainian market. If not today, then tomorrow. Energy strategy, its approval, and what is most important, not to change it every year is one of the things which are to be done as soon as possible. Creating the gas stock exchange. We need to also launch that project. If we correctly give this information that here these projects they are operating, then the European companies will come here, they will better understand Ukrainian market, they will quicker refuse from Russian more risky projects, which is the Nord Stream 2. Now, short-term things, I would like to address all journalists, political experts, economic experts, Ukrainians, all experts. If you think that Nord Stream is just an energy topic, you are mistaken, because Nord Stream 2 is one of the arguments why It's one of the arguments why Russia is not trying to conduct more large-scale war, hybrid or non-hybrid, on the territory of Ukraine, because transportation of gas via territory of Ukraine is a huge argument for European countries, for the countries of EU to be here and to watch every step of internal and external policy of Ukraine. That's the issue of security, and it's not the issue for 10 years ahead, but that's the issue of our daily security. So there's a big request. Let us get united and let us think on how we should work together with the government to think how we can overcome such threats. And another thing I would like to mention, such experts as Mr. Alan Riley, Mr. Krutikhin, not all such experts are so knowledgeable. There are experts who can make their assessments and give some proposals to the government based on some general assessment, and it is very important to work not just in Ukraine but abroad to explain what's happening in Ukraine, what reforms we are implementing, and why Nord Stream 2 is not just a threat or the issue of legislation, European legislation, but it's also the issue of security for the countries of European Union. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank our MPs who remain in place here to listen to these comments. And I have a specific question. In your opinion, in December, January, February, during this session at the Verkhovna Rada at the Parliament, so can we expect that the Parliament will address more the since completion of approval of all decisions which are needed for the natural gas market law to become working, and also unbundling of Naftogaz process to be completed, which are very important to demonstrate that Ukraine is consistent with European legislation. When this topic is covered in mass media, we can see that journalists do not understand all links and the issue of but situation in the east of the country. Yes, this of course has influence, but we should understand that we need reforms ourselves in order to strengthen our position in negotiations. And the electronic declarations took place 1 month ago. And what are our new achievements? How we move forward? Visa-free regime. If it is not approved, how Ukrainians can reform in different areas. As concerns the energy sector, I can say instead of all problems that we need not pressure, but unfortunately during 25 years of dependence from different oligarchs, in our internal competition between oligarchs, Ukrgazvydobывание and Nishenka, there are billions which were not received by the budget of Ukraine. So we still see so late delayed signing of the natural gas market law by the president. And what Ms. Olena Zerkal said, internally we are unpredictable for many of our Western partners. When the Commissioner on Energy issues come, and at the level of President he promised one thing, and by the government it is promised other things. When they set deadline for us and we promised to be consistent with the deadline, we sign documents only when we remember that we have some deadlines just several days before the deadlines. So this is the barriers. Our system is barrier to becoming predictable partners. So we should not play to the violence of oligarchs. It is a very strange issue when we hear some things that coal is brought from Donetsk and Lugansk to the territory controlled by government. If we want to be a winner in energy wars, which are most complicated ones in energy wars, we should be predictable partners which deliver the promises, which fulfills the obligations. Thank you. Everything which concerns the works of Energy Committee, I can say that as of today, when the natural gas market law was adopted and the plan of Naftogaz of Ukraine restructuring was approved, reforms of Ukrtransgaz, a company which directly manages gas transportation pipelines, an important issue is to complete the arbitration trial in Stockholm, because unbundling depends on Naftogaz winning in this court case. We hope that in 2017 we will be at the finishing point, and this case will be to our benefit decided. So we should be stable. We should not take unpredictable decisions as concerns reforms of Naftogaz of Ukraine, and we should assure our European partners that the process would be within the deadlines as set. As concerns the law and its influence and secondary legislation, yes, they are present, and the main issue is to address the matters of gas distribution networks at the level on the demand side. We can introduce the competition, and here the Cabinet of Ministers should play, because the laws and bylaws, the laws have been adopted. We need bylaws, we need regulations to be issued by the Cabinet of Ministers. So this process is now procrastinating, and we do not see final decisions how this operation of gas distribution networks would be finally decided. As concerns natural gas market, it is important in energy security terms to increase the amounts of natural gas produced domestically. Here the ambitious goal is set to increase the production to 20 billion cubic meters by 2020, and our Verkhovna Rada supported the initiative on decreasing the rentals in order to promote investment into this industry and to allow investors to come, independent investors, commercial investors, to come to Ukraine to increase Ukrainian potential of gas production. We will strengthen our energy independence. Such initiatives, they are planned by the end of the year, and we also expect the next week the Committee on Energy will submit for voting for the second reading the electricity market law, and this would help Euro integration of Ukraine. Thank you. As for me, it is very important to ensure that our cooperation with the energy community is really mutual and mutually beneficial. What we have now, the problem which appeared due to the adoption of the articles of the newly established company, which would manage the main pipelines, this does not promote further fruitful cooperation. I hope that we will close the gaps and to ensure fulfillment of our obligations despite of all the complexities in the process, and we will hold the meeting on December 19 of the Council. This board's meeting can be used to raise the issue on the European Commission decision, which supported German's decision on APAL Opel. So in this case, we can use Article 274 saying that all decisions about networks should be adopted on the basis of previous consultations, which have not been conducted. This is also one of the ways which we would go in our negotiations on the further construction of Nord Stream 2. If we fail to achieve reasonable results in negotiations with the European Commission, we can use more formal approach according to the Article 305 of the same association agreement, which is also about previous consultations before disputes. So we should work more actively in protecting our interests and use all possibilities. That is why we should have good relations with energy community. They can be our good partners in this case. Now I would give the floor to Ms. Olena, but I would like to comment. I have commented that unbundling should be completed after the decision in Stockholm court, but for unbundling to be completed within 30 days, as it is said in the plan, we should put very many efforts in creating a steering committee, in negotiations with investors and other things. Unbundling depends not only on Stockholm decision, but on many other things. We should work on them and not forget to do this work. I would like to remind you that next year decisions on the first hour dispute in Stockholm, they will be in the first quarter of 2017, then also in the second quarter of 2017 there will be decisions in other cases. So the natural gas market law will work in full since April 2017. The regulations on the steering committee also will become in full operation, in full effect since the second quarter 2017. We should understand that we should have sense of urgency, that we are very short of time. There are very many processes abroad in the Western countries, what is happening in politics and elections in many countries, and Russia's active efforts. We should do our best not to delay.
This is a good tradition to sum it up, to offer very specific steps for the Cabinet of Ministers.
Summarize the discussion, if you might.
I think there are a number of things here which are really important. One of the issues which which we've been discussing is the compliance of the EU and energy community rules in Ukraine. And there's a direct link here between getting foreign investment in and Nord Stream 2. The more we comply with the rules in full, so for example, you have the Ukraine, all the issues to do with unbundling earlier in the year, which was problematic. You've got, I think, current discussions about changing the charter of Naftogaz, which would not be in compliance with EU and energy community standards. You've got various other games being played within the Ukrainian polity, which begin to destabilize investor confidence. But there is another argument here which is really important, and I think that's really important in terms of what it does to potential foreign investors. But there's another element to this as well. It relates to Nord Stream 2. The argument that we're trying to run here is in large part that the EU should comply with its own rules. It's much more difficult to make that argument if we are not complying with the rules as well. So it's going to be much easier to make that argument if we have got a clean sheet, that we're in full compliance with that,
the the elites in the country recognize that you just have to function within the EU rules. And one of the arguments about this is that if it's done properly, it actually really works. There's a great chart the European Commission have of all the countries in Europe which have liberalized, and all the countries which have liberalized to the greatest degree and fully complied with EU rules all have lower energy prices and greater alternative sources of supply. They're more secure and they have lower prices. I think that's part of the argument here. And the other argument, which is an issue for a lot of the people who hold energy assets in Ukraine, is that the more you actually fully comply with the rules, the greater the increase in the value of your assets. One of the amazing things which happened when the UK did the first major liberalization of the gas sector in the 1990s was that when we did it, the asset values massively increased. Because once you liberalize the networks, it became clear that the networks were more valuable. When they're vertically integrated, the value of the networks will tend to be suppressed, because the incentive is to minimize the amount of gas going through and increase the price. Whereas if the networks are owned independently, what tends to happen is you tend to put more gas through, the price falls, and the asset value increases, because overall you're making more money. So actually the effect is likely to be very, very positive for Ukraine. But all the political stuff which happens in Ukraine for a whole host of historic reasons and oligarch clans playing games, is getting in the way of Ukraine being able to deliver more for its own people and externally to combat threats like Nord Stream 2. I'll stop there.
Спасибо большое. Якщо є
Thank you. If you have questions from the audience now, thank you. And to all the participants, thank you, Mr. Krutikhin. Thank you for participation. Thank you for discussion. We'll get back to it in half a year with the analysis of what was done.